It's my great pleasure to have the opportunity
that's what I'm thinking.
To chair the last session that we have today. We've left, I was going to say the best to last, but maybe that would be unfair because we've had some wonderful panels, some very important topics that we've been covering through this period since we started today morning. But we certainly have left the most global to the end. Ahora voy a, como todos los otros paneles.
He will say it in English now. And he will say it in Spanish now. Now let's talk about the future of Latin America. Let's see if there's a positive outlook about this region for the future. We left this conversation for last, the geopolitical situation of the countries from Latin America. So I have the great pleasure to announce a fabulous panel with very strong speakers. First, I'll present my panel, and then we'll hold a conversation with them right away, well known by everyone. Ángel Gurria, former Secretary General of OECD. I can do it better in English because otherwise I'm going to translate one of your positions and one of your tenures in the wrong way. I won't do it.
Exactly. Bueno, great to see you, former head of the OECD, but very importantly also former foreign minister and finance minister of Mexico. He did a full 15 years as Secretary General of the OECD. As we were discussing yesterday, a good amount of time to have a job for, which we agreed. And
like some others.
That's what I mean, exactly. I fully agree with it. I think it's a very good year, good pace to get to. But I think an important thing to note is during his tenure, he broadened the OECD's membership quite significantly to some more emerging countries, including, at least I have on the list here, 3 from Latin America, Chile, Colombia, and Costa Rica, along with others. And although it looks like it's been delayed a little bit longer for its full ratification, the International Tax Treaty is going to definitely go down as, I think, one of the great achievements during your tenure as Secretary General, along with some of the other implementation work on anti-corruption. And the OECD has become a kind of reference point for best practice in global regulation, global standards on a lot of the big international problems that countries struggle to be able to agree on positions to without that kind of separate but still intergovernmental approach the OECD provides. So thank you very much indeed for being with us on this panel. Ambassador Tom Shannon, further to my left, Ambassador Tom Shannon was a career ambassador, the position that has been reserved for very few others. Tom Pickering is somebody that comes to mind, I think, as well. It's the top kind of career foreign service position in the American diplomatic system. It's a position he held through 2018, so through a very pivotal period. He was a specialist, well, in that role, let me go to that first. I note here on the bio that you led bilateral and strategic stability talks with the Russian Federation. So we will definitely try to get a little bit of insight from you, Tom, if we can. On that later on. Also did some of the work making sure compliance, I noted that word as well, with the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the deal with Iran. But importantly for this panel, additionally, he served as ambassador to Brazil, and he was the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemispheric Affairs. And as we will all see later, a fluent Spanish speaker. So, Tom, thank you very much for joining us, taking some time off from your senior international policy advisory role for Arnold and Porter right now. Joining us online, who we will see shortly, is Maria Emma Mejia, who is the former foreign minister of Colombia. Fantastic to have her with us. She also served at one point as Minister of Education, but she's also had a strong diplomatic career, having been Colombian ambassador to Spain, and very importantly for this conversation, the permanent representative to the UN as well. So again, we're going to have that opportunity to look at multilateralism and where Latin America, how it plays its cards in that very important role. And we can see you on the screen right now, Mariema, so thank you very much for joining us. And I'm delighted that we also have Antonio Patriota, currently ambassador of Brazil to Egypt. He's also served as ambassador to Italy and also to the United States, and the one other place, like Mariama, to the UN. So a very distinguished ambassadorial career. He also served as foreign minister between 2011 and 2013. And the one other thing I would say is Antonio Patriota is a member with me of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Geopolitics. So fantastic to have him with us. So that's our panel. Ahora voy a seguir en español para que...
I will speak in Spanish, and now with the conversation to go back
Aquí.
to the spot in Mexico City. And a question for all of you. Let's see if we can decide whether we can share the same perspective about the global situation and the situation where the Latin American countries find themselves. The heading is Latin America next to China, Russia, US, and Europe. And I say Europe because in the European Union agenda, it's very limited. It's leaving some countries aside. So I will say Europe instead of the European Union. So I want to know if you agree with this perspective I suggested yesterday to all the participants. We find ourselves in a highly divided world, not only a more competitive world, but deeply divided. And if it's deeply divided, how is it divided? Now, after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, to the Ukraine, we see the transatlantic countries, the NATO, to reinforce their ties, to be stronger than ever. There are some ties being created with the Indo-Pacific countries, South Korea, Japan, Australia, especially. And on the other side, we have Russia and China. They seem to not be partners, but the no limits partnership, as said by President Xi Jinping and Putin before the Winter Olympic Games, the Winter Olympics. So we've seen the flights of bombers and an exercise carried out by the Chinese and Russian Air Force members, sending signals to the U.S. and the allies that this will be a deeply fragmented world. And so where do the rest of the countries stand in Latin America? This is a third part of the world that will be able to create a triangle in this world, or they will be left aside. How will they deal with that? So let me start online. Mariana, the reason why I'll start with you, and I hope we're ready online. I don't think that Mariam and many of her roles during the non-aligned movement in Colombia, the non-aligned countries, she played a very important role in the 90s, making sure and guaranteeing the existence of this group. And I would like to hear from her. Do you agree with this new fragmented, divided world, if not divided in two blocks, at least into two worlds? What's your take on that, Mayama? She was there, right? A couple seconds ago. Hi. Oh, good. Mayama.
Sí. No, creo que
I think this has shaken us up when this invasion started. We thought that Russia had the need to show how they would recover their own terrain, the terrain that anyway was theirs. But nobody ever thought, the world or the press or the media ever thought, not even United Nations thought that this would go beyond Kiev and that it would involve two non-aligned countries, historically neutral for over 70 years, such as Sweden and Finland, and to remove all the pieces and make the U.S. Recover a leading role in this partnership of the Northern Atlantic, maybe in such a way that this stemmed from a critical situation, the war against Afghanistan, and the United States is trying to level up to the power and Russia have now. So now shaking up the cards led to a strong alignment of the countries, member countries of NATO, the negotiations with Turkey. Let's see if we reach the necessary consensus. But we visited the United Nations. We were chancellors at the time with, and the fact that the Security Council took the challenge to not approve the sanctions against Russia, and they got to the General Assembly. This is an exception that the majority plenum with the abstentions from China, there's a movement here that awakened the ideas of President Putin, the regime imposed by Putin, striving for the grandeur of the Soviet Union that he lost. It's a moving volcano that now has exploded, and we are trying to see how we can get back on track. But we cannot welcome a war, never. But somehow there is something that the Western world had to show, that the European Union, Europe were absolutely dormant, the US and all the other powers went dormant. That's my impression. Thanking everyone, the colleagues at Chatham House, thank you. We love Chatham House, and we respect so much Chatham House. Thank you, Mayama, for your kind words. And thank you for this analysis, and most especially and what you said at the end. The European continent, like the Sleeping Beauty, lost its geopolitical power. And Antonio Patriota, tell me, do you share this perspective too, or do you have anything to add to this analysis of a fragmented world? And maybe the experience you've had in the United Nations and in Egypt, because Egypt stands aside on the lookout for these fragmentations we see internationally. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel with all my friends, Emma, Tom, Shannon, and Angel. If we look from far away, we're under the impression that the world is divided in two because a bilateral relationship, the most important one in decades to come, will be the relationship between China and the US. And this relationship can end in a frank hostility or a cooperation mode. So we hope that they will develop it as best as possible and not be hostile to each other. But another analysis is, as the Secretary General of United Nations, Antonio Guterres, talks about multipolarity, multi-dimension. I interpret this expression. For instance, in the military plan, we have two or three main actors: the U.S. with NATO, China, and Russia. Since they're uh, together for a little while, but they each have their interests. If we look at India's stand, that does not agree with China, but did not want to condemn Russia at the General Assembly. If we look at the economic plan, the G20 shows there's a multipolarity because the European Union is big actors such as Japan and Great Britain that is not a member of the European Union, and other developed countries. And for the first time, developing countries that have some global influence, global presence, such as India, Brazil, South Africa, South Arabia, and the other members of G20, and even more countries that are not part of the G20, Colombia, Turkey, and some others. And in the diplomatic scenario, I think that the influence is well distributed. It's not tripolar, because in the diplomatic sphere, the diplomatic and military forces do not determine anything. A good example, the Vatican. They don't even have a territory, but they have a great world influence. Pope Francis was the most commended character at the General Assembly, and he got a standing ovation. So in the diplomatic arena, there's a lot of leeway. And as a scholar ambassador from Singapore, and he was ambassador before the United Nations. I think that the international community would rather not have to choose between a hegemonic agenda and another hegemonic agenda. What most of the population countries want is a system based on international law to be complied by everyone and complied with by everyone, and there are areas where we still don't have or don't see a multilateral cooperation that has been well developed, for instance, in regard to climate change or the new technologies. So what apparently calls for fragmentation, in reality, this is a very complex landscape with lots of room for countries to work in a creative manner to build constructive agendas in favor of a positive international collaboration. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for depicting this complex landscape with different zones and areas with different power groups. Tom, if I go to you now, how do you view that from your own long diplomatic career, how do you view this fragmentation between the countries that the maligned actors, as called by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in the United Kingdom? We hear these terms in Russia, China, malignant actors. But do you see this division or not? Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this very interesting panel with my colleagues, Mayema, and Antonio, Angel, great diplomats who've left their trail in the world. I share Antonio's view. There are divisions and fragmentations that are stronger with the relative decline of the U.S. and the ascent of other powers. But by the same token, I'd like to add that the same way there are differences, there are opportunities, and we need to understand that the stain of following the Westphalia model, that's still important. the most important actor in the global order. But in time, societies and the peoples have raised their voice, and they've become capable of acting, being leaders, and clearly indicate that they will not be the targets of powers. There are new powers circulating around the world. It's a power of societies. And it's interesting to look at Ukraine, because what's happening in the Ukraine is not the state of Ukraine fighting the state of Russia. It is the people of Ukraine, the Ukrainian society facing Russia, confronting Russia and saying, we will not back up, regardless of your power. So the leadership of President Zelensky is very important, but he's a surfer. He is surfing the crest of the wave on top of the rejection of the people of Ukraine, and because he gave up to Russia, and he yielded to Russia, and we're in a world where hegemony is growing, and what's necessary for diplomats to understand and for the states to understand is to gain power and use it well. We need constructive agendas, positive agendas that can get states and countries close together and empower people. And so I believe that although we face great challenges now, Russia is a great challenge. How to handle the relationship between the U.S. and China, that is a juggling act. And the diplomatic capacity to tap on these opportunities, we can change the 21st century and turn and make it very different from the 20th century. I thank you for this perspective, perspective take, and with important arguments. Angel, how do you view the world after these three presentations?
I think that we have gone from impressionism to pointillism, and I fully concur. We now, our world is more polarized than ever before, more divided than ever before, and in spite of the cohesion that the invasion triggered, in the case of what I would call the West. The West means the United States, Europe, and also in some way certain Asian countries who have traditionally been, and with whom there are military treaties between them and the United States, Japan and Korea. Notwithstanding, the world is more divided than ever. And this is the result not only of the invasion exacerbated these underlying divisions in its own way, and also beyond that, it forced states to take a position. You're either for or against, or you abstain. But abstaining in itself became a position, and this it is very hard to not join the fray. And the shock was of such magnitude, it was so brutal, that it violated all the principles which we know to such an extent that beyond any rationalization one could provide from NATO, Europe, the Bucharest Accords, in truth, this came as a complete shock. And it entrenched positions, divided nations. And the result of that is that the world is more turbulent, it's confused, it is more complex, but also this is a world in which the key players have come to the fore evermore. So these divisions, these points contribute to the full picture, to the painting. But it is the main actors who are putting their markings on the canvas. And this is not just the United States, but now also Russia, China, Europe as a bloc. Although, when you come from Europe, especially after 15 years of living there, one understands that Europe is not a unit, but still there is an ever-growing process by means of which it is gaining cohesion. But there's a growth, a spike in Germany's military budget, and there's a response to what American presidents have been requesting for quite some time, what Trump with a certain dose of brutality demanded, requested, and what is now taking place for the wrong reasons. So this brutal invasion, Russia invading Ukraine, has triggered this. Obviously, the change of administration in Germany also contributed to that. But I would add that this has altered the world profoundly in an unexpected, brutal manner. But beyond that, I would also say that even just a few days prior to the invasion, I would confess, I thought no, there will be no invasion. And people were saying, the President of the United States was saying, yes, there will be, the invasion is coming, our intelligence services. And maybe it was pure wishful thinking, but I was saying, no, there will be no invasion, but we now know what happened. And I believe that the shock of events, it was so unexpected to so many, has, and all the emotions that have flowed into these decision-making processes. Well, I would like to know, from your point of view and based on your experience, the United Nations and the credibility of the Security Council, can it survive this, a time such as this? One of the most powerful countries is behaving in a manner so egregious. I have a great many friends from the Middle East who say, well, Iraq, the United States, they did what they wanted. But at least with Iraq, well, there were certain resolutions. There was a resolution about in support of a possibility of a military intervention. But in this instance, that did not exist. They did it for their own reasons. So with this demonstration of what might be termed might is right in terms of international law, this has constituted a shock that weakens the United Nations, that weakens the UN Security Council. What do you think? Well, I agree completely. I think that this weakening of an organization such as the United Nations, and its most important organization, the Security Council, with an ongoing battle for more than 3 decades for reform in terms of veto powers after the war, to grant it to the country that most represents the geopolitical realities of the world, it proves more necessary than ever. And the Secretary General has talked about this political role, and they confronted Russia Foreign Minister Lavrov in the position derived from his stance on how China at the very start of the conflict has not joined Russia in this decision. And in geopolitical terms, I think this is highly strategic. They have kept themselves at the margin, but these two powers have not become a bloc. They're not, so to speak, united as to bring down the West. But the United Nations is paying close attention to this in terms of refugees, food, health services. All of its organizations are working on human rights, the International Court. But the great protagonist, the country who should have been the great protagonist, gave up its position. And Europe has broadened the scope of its role in a way that we never thought possible. Gurria talked about this when he talked about Trump's visit. So when he was saying, well, what are you using our money for, my money for? But this decision, this political decision, did not serve, so to speak, the future of the United Nations at a political level, so as to recover that specific multilateralism, which is now dead or perhaps hurt at the United Nations. And what to say of a region, we will talk about that later. But I think that there is a lack here, a deficit in terms of how do we resolve a conflict such as this. I fully concur. I will now move on to Antonio. Same question to you. If we consider the United Nations, and if I understand Maria, she said that such important roles that it continues to play at a global scale in terms of climate change, the war on poverty, and so on and so forth, it still retains. Does it have cards to play, or are you concerned, Antonio, in terms of how this crisis may weaken the United Nations, and how it may deaden the voice of the smallest countries who have made use of the United Nations to take care of their interests in the global arena? There is no doubt that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a tragedy. This is a war that was fully avoidable. This aggression deserves condemnation of the whole international community. But my opinion of the United Nations is not so negative. First of all, the three main pillars of its activities: development, human rights, development. There has been a consensus in the 2030 agenda back in 2015. It's a new international consensus on sustainability. And this is quite something. And we're still working under the auspices of these agreements. And so the Human Rights Council is working. And it works through periodic revisions that allows for events to be analyzed and judged in a certain sense. Where the United Nations have not produced results is in terms of peace and international security. And it is in this field that I believe that the permanent members of the Security Council have set a terrible example, because most, if not all, have violated the UN Charter and its main precepts in terms of not using force unilaterally and in not violating other countries. And Russia has not been the only country to do so. And if we remember Kofi Annan, the memories of Kofi Annan, where he said that the United Nations have fully lost their credibility. He said still that he would spoke about Iraq and the false pretenses under which that war was started. And the condemnation of Russia's war in the Ukraine got a majority vote, 2/3 of the organization. And personally, I welcome the fact that Western countries who up to recent times were relativizing the idea that of territorial integrity and sovereignty, this resolution, by means of this resolution, they have committed to these principles, and they condemn the unilateral use of force. In terms of the UN Security Charter. So if this is sincere on the side of Western countries, I think that we have a renewed consensus in terms of the inadmissibility of the unilateral use of force, because China in its own way also holds this principle as central. And traditionally, Russia has done so also. So when the dust settles, and when emotions cool down, it is possible that we may have the chance to renew our commitment, our international commitments on certain fundamental principles for cooperation. Thank you for what is a realistically positive point of view. And I think that it was at the turn of the year that there was an agreement of the United Nations with certain key countries around the non-proliferation of nuclear armament, which was quite surprising given the context at the time. And I would like to raise a slightly different question here. Will Biden attend G20 if Vladimir Putin attends? And I raise this question because I believe that one of the alternate systems or parallel systems working in parallel to the United Nations has been G20, starting in 2008, 9, 10. But at this time, the G20 has become a key focal point of international tension. So how does Washington look at this? Would it be possible for presidents such as Joe Biden to be present at the same forum where Vladimir Vladimirovich attends? Great question. And I do not have a great answer to that, because nobody at the White House has asked me that. But what would you advise then? And watch out. Well, in truth, Indonesia will invite President Putin. The United States and other countries will do what they can to stop it, but I see no way for Indonesia not to get away with inviting him. But this will be a time a moment that will define G20 into the future. So I believe that the United States must make its presence felt. The United States must have a voice in G20 because it is their brainchild along with its allies. I recall the day when it was established. But if I may add something with regard to the United Nations, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine was an announced invasion, and it was not announced recently. It was announced in 1999 when Putin took on the presidency for the first time. He said it again in 2008 with Kiev coup, when the pro-Russia government was overthrown, and then once again in 2014 when Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula. The only thing that stopped Russia from invading before was the state of its armed forces, and Putin worked day and night, improving his capacities until he was able to do so. So the question to the United Nations is not so much why did it not respond to this crisis, but where was it during the invasion of Georgia? What Russia did in Moldova, Transnistria, and other regions in the east of the Ukraine, and its annexation of Crimea. And to me, this is the great big challenge the United Nations facing going into the future. Not only how to stop a crisis in the moment, but how to anticipate crises. And there's a way perhaps to make it clear that there is global consensus against any such action. But I think the United Nations will have a great big task after the war in the Ukraine, simply due to the fact that Europe will be organized. The structure will be very different if Sweden and Finland gain membership into NATO. Europe, well, they will be part of the European community. There's no way to stop that. So Russia will be faced directly with NATO in a highly volatile manner. So the United Nations will have a lot to do in Europe. Not in Africa, not in Latin America, not in Asia, in Europe itself. So Latin America is a good place. That's something positive for this region. Like I'm going back to London soon, but I wanted to ask Angel a slightly different, I'd like to pose a slightly different question, inspired on the answer that Tom has given us. In your opinion, and this is a personal opinion for sure, should then Joe Biden invite Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua to the Summit of the Americas for the very same reason that Indonesia will be inviting Russia? So is it best for America to make itself present? Should we avoid any further divisions? Where does the Summit of the Americas stand in that sense? A comment on the United Nations having served as Chancellor and having been extremely close to all of these events when all 5 countries with veto powers in the Security Council of the United Nations is subject of the issue at hand, or is the one that causes the problem. The United Nations basically ceases to function. The design is such. This is how it was structured. This was the reason it was planned as it was planned. This is why Italy and Germany want to change it. And Brazil also. And Brazil, by the way, who have been insisting on it. I recall when I informed President Cedillo that we were to join the Security Council of the United Nations, and that truly it would be possible for us then to negotiate with Honduras, a main rival in the nation. And he says, tell Honduras that it will be a great honor for them to represent us in the Security Council at the United Nations. And then he asked me, do you know where Namibia is? By then I knew. And he said, well, 99% of people do not know. But we'll have to fight all these other countries over Namibia, and that is not a key priority for us. The point is that the design, the very design, the structure of the United Nations is such And I agree that Gutierrez may well have spoken up before, but how to take this on? Even the implication here is there's a whole process involved. So going back to Robin's question, it's quite simple. Yesterday we were talking about how Mexico's president of Mexico. We talked about it yesterday, and the conclusion a little bit was that, yes, he should go. He should attend the Los Angeles summit, the Summit of the Americas. And among the things that perhaps there, they say, well, it's perhaps best for them all to get together, for them all to attend, but because then he will make himself heard, and there's a kind of amplifier at the meeting, a loudspeaker, given that this is the Summit of the Americas, and everyone is paying attention. And I think that the same thing would happen in this instance on the topic of Biden and Vladimir Vladimirovich. And I think that President Biden and certain other countries will do what they can, as Tom has stated. Indonesia will make it impossible not to invite Russia, and it will depend on whether Russia feels that it is welcome or not, and whom they send, and whether it is Foreign Minister Lavrov or President Putin himself. But I would say that we should attend G20. We should attend the summit for the very same reasons, to provide all the reasons, to make ourselves heard, to make all the reasons for which this is unacceptable. And let me tell you, the comment, what I wanted to tell you is that I believe that Vladimir Putin made the worst possible strategic error. I believe that the world is learning to live without Russia, but Russia cannot possibly live without the world. As an example, the most highly sensitive topic, energy. Europe, the most highly dependent region, has had no more carbon imports. And there's consensus, for instance, with the exception of Hungary, who resists this, to veto oil imports from Russia. So oil is on its way. Gas, well, it's a little bit slower because there's a 40% dependency on Russian oil. That'll be slower. But there are talks about how to substitute for that. And 210 billion euros have been approved by the European Union for how to reduce its dependency throughout Europe on Russian energy. So what we're talking about here, once again, is of how the world will learn to live without Russia. And the opposite is not quite possible. The other problem is that Russia constitutes less than 2% of the world's economy. The same in terms of foreign investment, the same in terms of trade. And so this is becoming quite clear. Russia is tiny, not so China. We're talking about Russia here. And so then, what will happen? This facilitates a transition to a world, well, if Russia continues to be hostile, and all of what Vladimir Putin wished to avoid is now taking place. There is NATO has consolidated. Europe has consolidated as a bloc. The Baltic states, Poland. I mentioned Germany a few moments ago. Germany's rearmament. And so what we're talking about here is Finland, Sweden. These are extraordinary events. And now it happens that they have formally applied to join never has there been a faster process for membership in NATO as this will happen. I guarantee that. And at the end of the day, well, and beyond that, sanctions will begin to hurt people on the street, not only oligarchs, not only the leadership, not only the girlfriends, but also people out in the streets, and that will generate instability, that will create problems for Russia. Thank you very much. What interesting prospects for the future. We have half an hour to go. I do not wish to keep you any longer than we absolutely need to. We absolutely must. I would like to take some questions from the floor. The main question that remains open is, what position will Latin America take in this new world? And while you think of your questions, I would like to ask our panel. Yesterday, when I asked Marcelo Ebrard about the G20, he said, well, it's best if he attends and force Vladimir Putin to sign the declaration. The likeliest outcome is that there will be no declaration. It is also possible that Putin will not want to go. It would be very interesting. Will he leave the country? Will he leave Moscow? But I would like to, well, if there are any questions. Otherwise, I will have another further round with the panel here. But if you have any questions to this great panel, we'll now move on to the topic that we previously talked about, which is where does Latin America stand here and how can they best handle this geopolitical situation that we have described here. Could you talk about your country's position, mainly, if you'd like, in Colombia, but if you would like to speak more generally, whatever you wish. Well, I think that this is a great opportunity. I have been perhaps a little bit pessimistic in some of the things that I've said, but this summit, which is upon us in June, is a renewed opportunity to unite our hemisphere. The president of Colombia has talked about, well, for the very first time now, in a great long time, the United States will bring together the whole of Latin America with the pragmatic diplomacy that Tom knows so well in the United States. We have the issue of Venezuela and its oil, its natural resources. Cuba, with an incipient opening or a certain incipient closeness. In Colombia, we're strategic partners. There are very, very few countries with such status. And Bob Menendez presented the Colombian Act, this new relationship, this new Colombia Plan for Progress. It is a great project to renew our entire hemisphere. And I think this is an opportunity for President Biden, in spite of the fact that this is there are midterm elections, and it's possible that Florida may cost them the chance to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. But I believe that the hemisphere must unite. This is a political opportunity that we have not had in a long time. And you will recall when in 2007, the King of Spain told Chavez, "Why don't you shut up?" And this is a chance to look at all these leaders who, when we discuss strategy, policy, I think that if the president wishes to risk it all, well then there is no way to consolidate democracy in Latin America if we're not all present. So I think that this is a fantastic opportunity to get together and to speak face to face. half Latin America is left-leaning, half is right-leaning. So this is where we stand. So I think that this is a huge opportunity.
Well, opportunities are important. It's not only about threats. And Antonio Patriota, what's your take on Brazil? This is a time for opportunities, maybe stakes, or how's Brazil handling?
Me ocurre decir es que en este mundo de tensiones y de guerra,
World of tensions and wars in every region in the world. Latin America is a good example. We are a denuclearized zone after the Tlatelolco Protocol, free of massive destruction weapons, and Brazil will celebrate 200 years of independence this year and 150 years without having any type of conflict with the neighboring countries. We have 10 neighboring countries. We are one of the countries in the American hemisphere with the greatest number of neighbors. So from the military strategic point of view, Latin America is an example to the world. It is a world of peace. It is a territory of peace. We don't even have threats to the sub-regional peace. We are an example of stability. The second thing that could be said about Brazil is that we started a couple of years ago to position ourselves in a competitive world, in a competitive manner, in a multi-polarized world, where strategic partners to Russia, China, not for military strategies or hegemonic agendas, but just for exchange of postures, seeking complementarity. Angel Gurria said that Russia is a small country, but Russia is a producer of fertilizers for the Brazilian agriculture. For Egypt, Russia represents 40% of the national tourism, and it's an incredible source of income, and also and they produce wheat, very important. So this cannot be underestimated. They have a great civilizing historical tradition. So let's be careful. Let's not put ahead an aggressive state policy in the same category than the people of a nation, or succumb to Russophobia. In the economic plan, we have strategic relationships with the European Union, a partnership. Maybe, if you allow me, Robin, the relationship with the European Union is easier to us because we have the Roman law, the tradition of Roman law. And the U.S. and Great Britain have a different tradition. So England, Tom Shannon, and with the U.S., we have a very important relationship. And today we focus on every possible topic belonging in the international agenda. So multipolarity is an opportunity. No doubt China has become the main trade partner for Brazil since 2009. And Brazil is one of the very few countries in the world that has a great trade surplus. So we had a great surplus compared to China. And so we have no difficulties, no political, just strategic difficulties with China. Well, thank God, because of the distance, maybe. And going back to the diplomatic field, there's also an opportunity there. And I mean the Arab reality, because in Cairo we also find the League of Arab States, and we are always in touch with many ambassadors from the region. And the main feeling is that in this new world order, we need to talk to all the centers of power, but also establish very tight cooperation links in a new non-alignment. Brazil has never been a member of the non-aligned group, such as Colombia, but this is a commitment in regard to international law, a constructive agenda. There are many sustainable development challenges, eliminating poverty, climate change, and so on and so forth. And we don't want to lose precious resources with wars and warfaring. Thank you, Antonio. Tom, Angel said that Russia is becoming isolated. It's shrinking because of its decisions and because of the invasion against Ukraine. But we see that countries like Russia and most likely China can find other markets, other partners, other allies for the future. Is there a danger for the foreign policy in the U.S. because in their hemisphere they have become isolated, and countries like Russia and China can accelerate their relationships with the region, knowing that the debate in Washington focuses more on values, on the Chinese danger, on the fight against Russia. And so it's a binary thing, and they're seeking a more flexible world. So is this any concern for the foreign policy in the U.S.? Well, not so much, because the American policy from the White House or Congress, they understand that Latin America and the Caribbean are becoming globalized. They've been globalizing for at least 20 years, and hence the interest of China, India, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, and the European Union. Since today they have a presence in Latin America, and this is something positive for Latin America. That's good for the societies, for the economies. And in the perspective of the U.S., it's good that the globalization of Latin America is happening at a time when Latin America has an engagement in regard to free market, democracy, and the importance to have a regional integration using trade activities as the engine of the economic growth. The problem here is the organization and the way in which Latin America globalizes. If it globalizes company by company, firm by firm, market by market, country by country, or builds a consensus between the countries and how to do it, the Chinese are experts in getting it, tippy-toeing into the markets, no noise, buying here, buying there, and little by little building a reality and buying allies, partners, and to serve their businesses. And at the end of the day, they will define how a state can relate to China. And in going further, and a deeper vision from our colleagues in Latin America would help us. But this is something that can work for the U.S. and for the U.S. diplomacy in the region. And a brief comment in regard to the Summit of the Americas. That has to do with that. You must remember that in 2001, in April, at the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City, Canada, the leaders reached an agreement in their communique and the democratic clause that any rupture of constitutional order or the democratic process would suffice to detach any country from the process of the Summit of the Americas. And with the Inter-American Democratic Chart, they defined the region as a democratic region. So when Cuba finally joins into the Summit of the Americas, not as a member of the summit, but as an special guest from every host as a process of bringing in Cuba and solve the issues between the United States and Cuba. If someone like the president from Mexico has an interest to putting aside something that was a consensus from the summit, not from the United States, but all the countries that participated in the summit that has lasted for 2 decades. So it's not 2 months prior in chit-chatting. No, in Los Angeles, talking to the leaders. That's from my own point of view. Thank you, Tom. I remember we still have 20 minutes. If you have questions, you'll raise your hands. I see 2 hands, all 3. Angel, first. This is important because you had things to say. Maybe we heard from the panelists that this may be an opportunity for Latin America if they can make the most of this opportunity. Well, opportunities, we should never let them pass. We should always talk, grab the opportunities. Of course, Antonio. Never Russophobia. No, it's not. It's not about any reactions against the Russian people. No way. I said that through sanctions, because sanctions target companies, exports firms, well, this will start biting. This will start hurting the streets. If we talk about 3 very sensitive products, energy, food, and metals, crucial metals for the production of chips, for instance, the semiconductors and ingredients for the semiconductors. So this will last about 2 years. But now, the forecasts in regard to inflation, the inflation in Mexico certainly, but also the U.S. and also in Europe and also Japan. And at the end of this year, the inflation will be less than the average year, but that's also true for the 4th quarter of 2023. Things will become normal. The production relations will become normal. So it'll be less complicated to say, let's leave aside Russia. Now, China has become a very important partner for Latin America. They're very important now, and with the exception of 3 or 4 countries, China is the most important trade partner for the region, and one of the great exceptions is Mexico, sure. Very important, and Africa. And I would say that in Latin America, and the U.S. is always in Latin America. The U.S. is always there. Is ever present. And if the going gets tough, the tough gets going, right? So we all have this intuition, and we know the course and where exactly we should become aligned. The world is a lot more complicated. But at the end of the day, I think that's important. And because not only do we long for the free trade agreements, NAFTA was one, but we're more and more part of the western part of the world. We are more and more part, we are better and better integrated to these trade streams. For instance, with the nearshoring, we have great opportunities, but why? Not to have more investments from China, but to compete and even displace some of the productions made in China and made them here right next door, because just in time is now pushing the car and cross the border. So let's not let us not scare our clientele, our customers, because we have the clients right there. And based on all the changes that are happening, remember that we stopped growing. We left the recovery since 2018 because of the commercial strains between the U.S. and China, China-U.S., whatever, the tariffs and trades that were imposed. But then the U.S. Imposed tariffs even to the free trade agreements with us. So the truth is that there is this possibility. We have this possibility today. And that's not the case of Russia. We don't even have such great trade deals with Russia, not even 2%. We're talking, this is a different ticket, a different scenario. That's it. Now, my comment in regard to the region and the world. We have been, well, like crabs. We've been acting like crabs, walking backward, backward, backward. And now we represent a fragment of what we used to represent 60 years ago in the scenario of trade, investments, the growth, the percentage of GDP from the world, what we spend. Well, it was clearly laid out. I was asking Carlos, what about the R&D, research and development, R&D, what about that? Well, the thing is, we're still there, stagnant, and that is reflected in our visibility in the world. Today, the voice of Latin America is ever so weak because we're barely seen, but if we don't even reach an agreement amongst us. As my granny said, well, that's voice and voice. So we have 10 minutes. Before nothing. And now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Listen, it's the end, guys. And Chris told me that he had brief remarks. Jorge will extend himself. Not just kidding. But we want participation, but we will take some questions, but please be succinct. Please be brief. Brief questions, please. Okay, in the back. In the back. Thank you. I didn't want to let this opportunity pass. From Jorge Armijo from Comexi, and building on the comments from the former secretary, what's the future of the World Trade Organization? We spoke about the world of United Nations, our opportunity areas. So what happens to the World Trade Organization, WTO, that's so weak? So I built trade will still be the driver of the economy. So how can Latin America recover its presence in the regional and global integration? Thank you for your comments. Congratulations. Thank you. Now here, another question. No, you need a microphone because Aribel Contreras, congratulations. My question is, what happens to Latin America? We see that this was one of the most affected regions, affected by the pandemic. Then we had a great commercial opportunities with this new geopolitical configuration between China and the U.S. We did not even tap on it, and now we have great opportunities in the crisis of grains with Ukraine and Russia are the great grain silos, and now the countries whose food regime is based on wheat. What do we need to do to have this push and turn crisis into opportunities? Good question. And now here, right there. Okay, I'm sorry. I must ask a question. I hear about this geopolitical vision. That's interesting. But Latin America and the relationship with the U.S. in this context, is it the same after Donald Trump? Is it different than before? Has Latin America started thinking about the U.S. as a different being, different than we thought before? Ah, very good. Okay, right behind you. Yeah, right behind you. Okay. Thank you. Araneli Misren, Ambassador from Norway. Thank you, Comexi, for this excellent event. My question about the sanctions. Angel, when you spoke about sanctions, it looks like you trust that this will have the desired effect in Mexico. When we discussed the sanctions with the Mexican speakers, the answer is that Mexico never joins the sanctions that have not been approved by the UN. Do you think that Latin American countries should join in the sanctions against Russia? Direct questions. Last question. Maybe we don't see clearly. Why holding and hosting the Summit of the Americas? Maybe there's an economic package that will give Latin America a chance to break the crystal roofs they have over their heads. If there's open call for the U.S. help the region recover, maybe this could be good now. To have a Latin American integration, or is it to compete economically, or will this be an integration to be confronted ideologically? And that's important because that's what's dividing the continent and the subcontinent. And finally, with Smith and Chris, we were talking about it. If they're going to invite the autocrats from this region, we should allow the oppositions from this country to raise their voice in that same scenario, at the same level, and that we can then talk about democratic alternates, human rights and freedoms, and no censorship. Thank you. A few minutes left. We've spoken a lot, Maria Emma. So you go first. You don't have to answer every single question. Just, is there an opportunity for Latin America in regard to the situation in Ukraine?
Varias preguntas. María Emma, a usted primero. Primera.
Just make a synthesis of the whole thing. Well, I would start with the last one. I understand it is difficult to to merge such different ideologies. It's very hard to hold such a summit in a region when at the southern cone and the ECLAC, and we were able to reach an agreement regionally. And finally, the ideology consumed it, exhausted it, and the hemisphere has no way to express it. Its only means of expression is the Summit of the Americas, where it's not only a political scenario. We don't need to go to Los Angeles. It is the future of our hemisphere. We are a region we need. It's not South America. It's not the leftist or rightist ideologies. We need to find the right opportunities. And I agree with this idea that this is a window of opportunities, Alejandro. Venezuela, 400,000 barrels. Colombia, with such a sound oil company trying to sell their oil in the Western world. So it's an opportunity. So I think we are doing it well and looking at the possibilities. So my conclusion would be that in the case of Colombia, we will have a first round of elections, and we will celebrate the 200 years of being one of the first democracies in the hemisphere with diplomatic relations right after Simón Bolívar. Thank you. Thank you, Mariana, for your words. Now, Antonio, I don't know, what question do you like, would you like to comment on? Well, about the sanctions and the U.S. in the region. Well, in regard to sanctions, there are multilateral sanctions. So we have a structural problem to hold a conference, but the fact the Latin American countries do not adopt sanctions, bilateral sanctions. And so the Europeans should have this awareness that they're doing something that most of the world doesn't do it because of they adhere to international, they abide by international law. That's still important to us. And a recent study from Cornell University I read about a month ago from an expert in sanctions who said that only 1/3 of the sanctions has a real effect, and in most cases they bring about more suffering for the civil population since they have nothing to do with the decision of invading or not invading. So we need to bear that in mind and know that many countries like Egypt and the country where I live, they had nothing to do with this war, not even with the expansion of NATO or the Russian resentment feelings, and they're paying for these sanctions because of the wheat imports, the interruption of tourism, and now they will have to devaluate their currency. Brief comment, and only the U.S.
And I would say to the colleagues in Washington that I dedicated a great many years of my career as I'm in the United States. My wife is American, and I have a deep appreciation for this country. But I believe that there is an issue of perception regarding Latin America. Public opinion in the United States, they see Latin America as a migration issue, as a drugs issue. They do not understand that we are countries with a very similar histories. They call us Latinos, but the fact is that Brazil is as African as it is Latin, as it is Arab and Japanese. And we call them the United States, Anglo-Saxon America. So we need an awareness of our shared history, of what we share, we have in common, that we have to see each other's siblings. And that is a little less difficult with Europeans, perhaps, because there is no issue with migration there. In any case, until we change this perception, this public opinion issue, a relationship will continue to be asymmetric and unsatisfactory. Thank you. Thank you so much, Antonio. And thank you for taking on this question on the relationship with the United States and how it has been changing. And Tom, could you possibly make some statements about this from your point of view, and the other questions also? Well, first of all, I think that the perception that Americans have of Latin America is deep and diverse, and it not only reflects the diversity of our society, but also our universities, our churches, and all the different organizations, civil organizations, who have deep and diverse links, rich links to the whole region. Unfortunately, this is not always reflected in our policy, and above all, not in our presidential campaigns. But I believe that in this day and age, there's a much deeper understanding of Latin America, which does reflect reality in a way that was certainly not the case a few decades ago. But to the question of what will happen in Latin America after Trump, it is a great question, most of all because President Trump was such a highly transactional president, so focused on how his decisions on foreign policy affected his domestic policy, that he had no interest in strategy, either conceptually or in any other way, or in bridge building. It was ransacking. The idea was how to use the region to improve his standing within the United States. And this is an aspect of American policy that will not disappear in the coming years, but it is thanks to China that American politicians will have to focus on Latin America, because they will have to face the fear that unless they become good partners within the region, then China will inject its influence in a way that will hurt American interests. This is a future that, well, in the balance. On the World Trade Organization, if Ngozi cannot make it work, nobody can. So we have to support this organization. We have to give it the time it needs, but also beyond that, countries who appreciate rules, there being rules, the United States has joined the list of countries that appreciate rules in foreign trade. A few years ago, it is only a few years ago that they did not like rules in foreign trade and they used to ignore them, but now it's a whole other situation. So please, Ngozi, he will pull through, and I believe that he is setting the political conditions that are needed in order to accomplish this transformation now. People say, well, thing is, trade will be the engine. Trade, yeah, well, sure. And investment, too. Both things together. And they are tightly linked together. What happened in Latin America? Why did we lose the opportunity, this chance on Latin America? It was a majestic own goal. But I'll give you some numbers. Productivity. From 2000 to 2018, Latin America, 0.33. All emerging and developing countries. All emerging and developing countries, 2.93. Asia, 4% development. This is just one example. Trade within the region, 17%. Asia, 38%. Europe, 60%. Which is to say, this is an own goal. Savings, investment, 19% in Latin America. Asia, 43%, and so on, and so on, and so forth. So it is absolutely, well, it is a self-produced injury. We shot ourselves in the foot, whatever you want to call it. And, well, it is never late to start to get on the right footing. And then one may recover, one may learn from past mistakes. And then one may start anew. Because otherwise these problems become ongoing issues and things never get resolved. So is America the same before and after Trump? Well, no. How can it be? to begin with, was such relief. I remember the day after, the months after. The issue now is how to establish relations with the new administration, which is concerned as concerns about things like we're talking about human rights, things other than trade. The interesting thing with a president such as Donald Trump is that he had some very concrete, specific objectives, very few objectives. And himself and the companies led this process. Now we have, the situation is more normal, quote unquote. Emma, Marantonio, people we have met here, and the more traditional style of diplomacy. And so it takes a little longer to establish relations. And beyond that, traditionally, the Minister of Agriculture speaks to the Secretary of Agriculture in the United States and Colombia and Brazil and so on and so forth. So there was a time during which this was a hiatus. Then the ambassador of Norway here said that, well, perhaps it may be easier, it may not be easier. Should Mexico support these initiatives or not? For someone such as I, who had the chance to serve as chancellor, when the United Nations gives us cover, so to speak, it becomes easier because you subscribe, you add yourself, you add your voice to the choir. You may be the third or the seventh or number 123, but at the end of the day, you're there with others, or with a vast majority perhaps. The issue is when countries take positions, which, given they are unique, they are very complex. When a country such as Mexico has issues which are, I would say, highly specific, perhaps even unique. And for this reason, this is oftentimes to be seen, to be reflected in foreign trade. We have several highly experienced diplomats who know far more than I do, but the ongoing debate on the defense of principles in diplomacy and foreign diplomacy, this is ever so helpful. This is key. Well, sometimes you have to have exceptions. Sometimes you have to adjust given circumstances. Well, yes, but having principles for foreign policy is key. And then you decide whether you go hand in hand with the rest of the world or you stand aside. And I will end with some remarks on Lorenzo's comment. I was at the summit in 1994, and Maria Emma was probably there also. We were colleagues, both served as chancellors, and it was Jim Wolfenson who organized. And the reason for which Jim Wolfenson organized it was not because he was president of the World Bank, but because he knew all the musicians. The 1994 meeting was pure music. Bill Clinton had this idea of gathering everybody because what brought us together was music. And so he found a kind topic to bring us together. But there was a fundamental issue at hand. The objective of the 1994 meeting was, there was one objective, was to create the free trade zone of the Americas. It was, at the end of the day, it did not happen, but that was the sole objective. Today, the agenda is far more complex. And by virtue of this complexity, well, China was not there. China did not have relations with Latin America. The point is that things were so much more simple back in the day, because you would either create the free market zone for the Americas, or you would not. Now the agenda has broadened and has become so much more complex. This is a great place to end on. We will have a few minutes more. This conversation has been truly phenomenal, and I thank all four panel speakers and those who are not here with us physically. I thank you for sharing your experience, for your conversations here, for your passions, for your intuitions. I started by describing a world divided, and now we have talked about a world of music and a world that is far more complex than ever before. But we have this gleam in the horizon, the silver lining. By contrast to this own goal, well, now we have to start scoring our own goals, because Europe will not be able to help with that. I end this and I hand the floor over to my colleague, and we'll now take a seat, and Chris will give his closing remarks in 5 minutes, I believe now.